Yesterday evening, on the 29th of September, Channel 4 broadcast a two-part documentary entitled Lucy Letby, Murder or Mistake. This was an adaptation of a feature-length film entitled Conviction, The Case of Lucy Letby, that was made by Daniel Bogardo. In the first video on this film, I will broadly review and assess its content. The first section of the film features a juxtaposition between the comments of Dr. Dewi Evans, who is the lead prosecution witness in the court case, and Lucy Letby's barrister, Mark MacDonald, who is pictured here. This is establishing the guide rail of the piece, which runs thematically throughout the entire documentary. Evans begins the documentary with the following words: "And I have no idea why anyone thinks that she's anything but guilty. I'm astonished with what her current barrister is doing. I think it's been absolutely disgraceful." I won't address the matter of why anyone thinks she's anything but guilty, as Evans put it at this point. I want to firstly address the notion that what her current barrister is doing is absolutely disgraceful. Now, immediately, it's reasonable to assert that this is a self-serving opinion. It's rather hard to consider Evans objective, considering that it is his head on the chopping block, as he is at least 95% of the prosecution case. The next thing to reflect on, as he never defines this himself, at least in footage that wasn't confined to the cutting room floor, was what has MacDonald done that is absolutely disgraceful? It seems to me that there are two possibilities here. The first is that this is another self-serving proclamation that it is absolutely disgraceful to have the temerity to criticise Dr. Evans. Well, if that is the charge, Dewi, then you can certainly consider me absolutely disgraceful, as well as hundreds of thousands of other people, including thousands of healthcare professionals. Funnily enough though, Dewi, there hasn't been an enormous amount of support for you. We haven't heard a peep from any of the other expert witnesses that you like to reference at every possible opportunity. Nor has there been a single credible or even remotely serious person who has come forward to support you. We will reflect on why that might be during this video, and also in my next video where I will be analysing Dewi's comments in more detail. But let me first continue with this point by noting the second factor to which Dr. Evans may be objecting. I assume, as Evans has said this previously, and Dr. Evans never tires of repeating himself, I mean really repeating himself, I mean literally repeating himself over and over and over again to a tiresome degree, I assume that Dr. Evans is referring to Mark MacDonald making public comments and having the audacious bravado of telling the world's media that the contrived hypotheses that Evans inserted into this case are complete crap. I will merely state briefly that considering the quackery of Evans has resulted in an innocent person receiving a brutal penal sentence, he isn't on particularly solid foundations when it comes to asserting that something is absolutely disgraceful. I would suggest that Evans himself is an absolutely disgraceful character, and I sincerely hope that before this is over, that this utter shyster gets his comeuppance. The reasons for this is that Evans himself has been a prolific commenter on the Lucy Letby case since its conclusion. It seems extraordinary that he could possibly criticise someone else for making public comments. Firstly, he spoke to Raj Persaud just days after Lucy Letby was sentenced. I won't speculate regarding the reasons for this. I will simply say that Dr. Evans had no need to do this, and it wouldn't be usual for an expert witness to make random media appearances. Since then, Dr. Evans has appeared in BBC articles numerous times, having given interviews to various BBC reporters. He has appeared on BBC Radio Wales more than once. He has appeared on BBC Panorama twice. He's been interviewed by Sky News more than once. Sorry about the close-up here, I understand that that's a fairly disturbing image. He declined to appear in a Channel 5 documentary, but insisted on providing a statement, although he changed his statement and its medical meaning between the first and second versions of the documentary, even though he'd said something different in court. He also wrote to Channel 5, indicating that he'd changed key diagnoses since the court case. He was interviewed by Talk TV. He has been interviewed by ITV more than once. He submitted his own statistical work, obviously I use the term work loosely, to the Daily Telegraph. Of course, Sir Napton only published this to take the piss out of him. He's been interviewed by the Daily Telegraph several times. He's spoken with the Daily Mail several times. He's provided comments to The Guardian several times. He's been interviewed by The Sun several times. He's been interviewed by The Times several times. He's made some particularly ludicrous comments to the British Medical Journal. He appeared in John Sweeney's podcast at some length. He was interviewed by the Welsh television channel S4C. Now, I've said a lot of negative things about Dr. Evans in several videos, and I'll be doing that in this video. But one thing I do like about him is that he only owns one jumper. He's like a cartoon character who always has to wear the same clothes. He's been interviewed by Good Morning Britain more than once, and finally he now features prominently in this new Channel 4 documentary wearing the same jumper again. Now, I want to emphasise at this point that these are just the media appearances and commentaries of Dr. Evans that I know about. He has been by far the most prolific media commentator on this case. Isn't it therefore a trifle hypocritical for him to be suggesting that McDonald is somehow morally wrong for pointing out publicly what a lousy job he has done? He's been only too happy to defend himself. Now, admittedly, he's done an absolutely abysmal job of this, but that's irrelevant. He's engaged in endless media self-promotion, far more so than anyone else associated with this case. So for him to claim that someone else's conduct is somehow distasteful is, I would say, utterly embarrassing. We then hear from the parents of a child that was treated at the Council of Chester in the documentary. Now, I want to handle this as delicately as possible because obviously they were upset and I accept this as a sensitive subject, but I personally question the validity of including them in the documentary, considering that absolutely nothing of any consequence occurred to their child. I'm sorry if they've been upset by the police, which they clearly have, but their comments in this documentary are of no relevance to the Lucy Letby case and even the indictment. I'm not really sure why so much time is devoted to them. It's certainly not an editorial decision that I would have made. I'm not going to say too much else about them in this video because, firstly, I don't wish to cause any offence to them. Their child did collapse in a neonatal unit. I'm sure that was a difficult experience. I don't wish to trivialise that. But I feel that their inclusion is indicative of an emotive slant to this film, as exemplified by an early narrative comment that this is the Lucy Letby story, which it really isn't. It's the story of medical and systemic failing. As an exemplar of this, Dr. Philip Hammond, who was reported on the Lucy Letby case for Private Eye, commented, "Are we going wrong? I think what worries me most about this is, hundreds of babies die avoidably in the UK, in the NHS, every year because they don't get superb care. And Chester clearly had problems with staffing. In the middle of the desk, one of the consultants wrote to the manager and said, 'We're seriously understaffed. We don't have enough nurses and doctors on duty. The whole thing's falling to pieces. And if you don't sort it out, babies are going to keep dying.' There were clearly serious problems, so if there are plausible alternative explanations to this that aren't murder, such as suboptimal care, and Mark McDonald can show that in a few cases, then all of the cases may fall." Now, I want to acknowledge that it's difficult for the documentary makers to have defence experts on the screen for legal reasons, but if I was making a documentary, I would personally focus on having experts such as Professor Colin Morley. There is some talk here about what Lucy was like as a person, but it's very clear that Lucy's character and behaviour is not consistent with a murderer. No one disputes this. Even the notorious and talentless hack David Wilson doesn't contest this. We then see Dr. Dewi Evans repeat his methodology. It's possible that he doesn't intellectually understand how flawed his process is, and he also makes similar claims to those he's made previously, including having not lost a case. This means that he's tone deaf to any criticism, as he's already been derided and ridiculed for saying this, and I would personally state that this is yet again indicative of his unbelievable level of arrogance. At a certain point, the narrator asks Mark McDonald the following question: "Can I ask you finally, this is the first time that some of these families are speaking publicly?" So immediately I would view this as a thoroughly disingenuous claim, and broadly speaking, this section is largely emotive nonsense. I'm sure that it's very upsetting to be in a hospital now if your child become ill, but there is nothing of substance here whatsoever, not least because the parents that feature in the film, their child is perfectly fine. That the child supposedly has learning difficulties, but I think to blame these on Lucy Letby without any evidence of wrongdoing, or that it's in any way linked to what occurred in the hospital, is frankly somewhat irresponsible. That there seems to be no medical basis to assert this, so I can't understand why the filmmaker has included this in the documentary. It doesn't seem to have any merit at all to me. There's also a section in which the family talk about Lucy laughing when handing them a keepsake box, as if she was amused by the prospect that their child was in dire straits. In my view, this is completely illogical for several reasons. Firstly, before we consider anything else, it's fairly obviously just a nervous laugh or an attempt to lighten the mood slightly in what is a tense and upsetting situation. I'm sure that literally everyone that watches this video has done that at some point, and it's hardly intended maliciously. Additionally, if this is supposed to be some indication that Lucy Letby is heartless, then if she was actually a murderer, she wouldn't deliberately laugh at the parents of an infant that she supposedly deliberately harmed. Although, why anyone thinks that she harmed this infant when the infant didn't come to any harm, and there's no evidence that the infant ever came to any harm, let alone is there any evidence that Lucy Letby deliberately harmed the infant, I really have no idea. Frankly, this should never be in the film. It just has no merit. I don't say this to be rude to the parents, but it frankly is total nonsense. It has no substance. I do believe that a better filmmaker would have cut this out immediately. As we know, this case didn't go to court because there wasn't enough evidence. Now, considering that the Child K case in the original Lucy Letby indictment did go to court, and that had literally no evidence, one wonders how little evidence there was in this case. Is it possible for there to be a negative amount of evidence? I'll have to put that to the statisticians and mathematicians that I now know. The only item of evidence is a box that was handed by Lucy to the parents. Now, it has been explained that this is handed out to all parents, and even the filmmaker himself, Daniel Bogado, conceded this in the Q&A that followed the initial screening in London. Dr. Svelena Dimitrova, who also features in the film, has commented on this on Twitter, so I'll just read out what she said. The box Lucy Letby gave these parents was not a bereavement box. Bereavement boxes are for families whose babies have died and contain personal keepsakes such as babies' handprints, footprints, name tags, first photos, etc. On the other hand, when a baby is taken away as an emergency, this is incredibly distressing for the mother, who won't be able to go with them as she's just delivered, and it is therefore best practiced, in fact I would argue it is essential practice, to update the mother as soon as a member of the team is available, and ideally to give her something tangible to maintain connection with the baby. As an example, I've worked in units where we would take a Polaroid photo of the baby in the incubator or bring a small bonding square carrying her baby's scent. Some units hand these items over individually. At the Council of Chester, they place them in what they called a treasure box. That's all it was. In other words, the news story here is Lucy Letby was following best practice and unit guidance when it comes to delivering compassionate neonatal care. This practice provides comfort and reassurance to a distressed mother unexpectedly separated from her baby. But Liz Hull spotted the word box and promptly stripped it of context. In her world, this routine compassionate practice is transformed into something suspicious and sinister, because heaven forbid the facts should get in the way of a sensational headline. Joanna Williams also testified about the introduction of treasure boxes for the families of very ill and soon to transfer babies. This was not only discussed in the original trial, it was mentioned again in the 2024 retrial. So the centrepiece of the Daily Mail article that Svelena is referencing there, and also a significant aspect of this documentary, we know has absolutely no merit whatsoever. Then Philip Hammond appears and explains that his inbox filled up with emails from really eminent people, including some of the most senior peoples in their field, saying, actually no, I think you're wrong, after he had initially written a column supporting the conviction. And he makes what is a critical statement. The bottom line for me is, does the evidence stack up? Which is an interesting comment, as throughout the film, those that have been recruited by the filmmakers to defend the prosecution managed to provide nothing of any substance whatsoever. Speaking of nothing of any substance whatsoever, we are then treated to the first appearance of Liz Hull. For those who don't know, she's a journalist for the Daily Mail who covered the trial, just mentioned in the aforementioned section by Dr. Svelena Dimitrova. Her role for at least half of her appearance in the film is to guilelessly repeat the prosecution case. So her first brilliant contribution is to say, in the end, the jury decided that Lucy Letby was guilty. How we could have gone on living without this trenchant insight, I have no idea. She then goes on to say, but I think all of us that were sat in the courtroom, I didn't realise you were in court, Liz. You really should bring that up more often. I don't think I've heard you mention that before. So she says, but I think all of us that were sat there in the courtroom understood why they'd come to that decision. It was multiple strands of evidence. The medical evidence was obviously important, but there were lots of different pieces of the jigsaw that came together. Yeah, the problem with the jigsaw is that those investigating decided what the picture was and then cut the pieces out after they decided this. I'll be focusing more attention on Hull and Cheetham in the weeks to come. I've previously ignored them as they obviously have zero integrity, but I did make this video analysing one of their podcasts previously. As I mentioned in that video, Liz Hull is not even remotely interested in what actually occurred in the real world. She shrouds legal arguments and arguments of jurisprudence around her like a tattered cloak in a vain attempt to appear credible. Indeed, she still thinks the so-called confession note is important, as she commented in this film. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the green post-it note on which she'd written, "I am evil, I did this, and I killed them on purpose." I think the police couldn't quite believe it, that they found something so significant when they raided her house. So, if Liz Hull generally believes what she's saying, which is doubtful, then we can infer three things from this. Firstly, she's made no effort to keep up with the case. Secondly, she has no critical thinking or analytical ability. And thirdly, she's citing an item of no significance, which has been thoroughly discredited in multiple different ways as being the most important item of evidence in the case. Now, I'm not going to go into discrediting this. The confession note has been so thoroughly dealt with by this point, I'm not going to go over it again. Just simply Google confession note Lucy Letby and you'll see media articles about it. There's stuff on this channel. You can search for notes in my channel homepage. It just really has no merit at all. It actually beggars belief that Liz Hull is still citing this as being important. She then goes on to say, the police uncovered 250 handover notes, most of which were in a bag under her bed. Those notes are supposed to go to the confidential waste bin. They aren't ever supposed to go home with staff. The prosecution said this was evidence that Lucy Letby was keeping trophies of her crimes. In response to this, Dr. Philip Hammond immediately noted that loads of nurses have said to me that they commonly take handover notes home with them by mistake. They've got them there, and it just happens because you're so busy at the end of the day. Now, of course, I've covered this endlessly on this channel because people always go on about the handover notes. I mean, how anyone could possibly think at this point in time that they're a legitimate item of evidence, I have no idea. But Liz Hull clearly wishes to assert that this is the case. So I just want to point these four things out. The fact that she's asserting that the handover notes are of such significance reiterates that she hasn't bothered to do any research on the case. We also know that she hasn't bothered to speak with any other nurses. Liz Hull is not concerned that the handover sheets are literally completely unrelated to the indictment. And then fourthly, Liz Hull obviously didn't listen to the court proceedings, as the allegation was that Lucy Letby kept these handover sheets as trophies, as she did just mention, whereas the prosecution itself conceded that only one note was treasured, and this was not even from the period covered in the indictment. In fact, it preceded it by 5 years. Yet despite these four things, she's still sitting there in a television documentary saying, "Oh, Lucy Letby took handover sheets home," as if that has any relevance to anything whatsoever. I just wanted to mention briefly this Daily Telegraph article on Liz Hull. The co-host of a podcast about Lucy Letby is facing claims of an appalling conflict of interest because her company was paid to train detectives involved in the case. Public records filed by the Police and Crime Commissioner for Cheshire show that 6 separate payments made by Cheshire Constabulary to Media Factory Limited between 2022 and 2024. The company was founded and run by Caroline Cheetham, the Daily Mail journalist who is the co-host of the trial of Lucy Letby with Liz Hull. The podcast boasted of securing exclusive interviews with detectives as it recounted the trial of the former neonatal nurse convicted of the murder of 7 babies and attempted murder of 7 more. The other co-host, Liz Hull, the Mail's Northern correspondent, was also listed as a member of staff of the company as recently as April 22, a month after payments from the police began. So I'll leave viewers to reflect on the significance of this as we continue to assess the contribution of Liz Hull to this documentary. Next, Liz Hull says they discovered that she'd done hundreds and hundreds of Facebook searches, often for the parents of the babies that she murdered and harmed. Some of the searches took place at very odd times, late on Christmas Day. Again, this is easily refuted. Basically, Hull is repeating the prosecution case because she's been taken in by it. The only question would be, did she do this because of direct financial support from Cheshire Police, or is she just as thick as 2 short planks and a lousy journalist, or is it both? Then Dr. Philip Hammond pointed out that since the trial, I can't find another neonatal expert who's prepared to back up the ideas of Dr. Evans. Find me one. I've said to Dewi Evans, you must know people who are prepared to back you up. He said, oh, I'm out of touch with everyone now, I can't find anyone. And Philip Hammond says, that's extraordinary to me. So I must emphasise at this point that there have been dozens and dozens of experts looking at this case now, medical experts across multiple disciplines and specialisms, and perhaps it's most important to emphasise medical experts that are actually neonatologists, unlike Dr. Evans, who is a long since retired paediatrician, who, as he's just mentioned, doesn't seem to know anyone who actually works in the medical profession anymore. There have been multiple neonatologists looking at this case now. No one has agreed with anything that Dr. Evans has said or done in relation to this case. No one. Not one person. We're looking at maybe, it's hard to say precisely, but at bare minimum, 50 experts in paediatrics and neonatology have looked at this case. It's probably a lot more than that, but bare minimum 50 have looked at this case, along with other doctors, along with other experts, along with other surgeons. No one agrees with Dr. Evans. No serious person, no credible person has come out to agree with a single word that this gentleman has uttered. Not one. Dr. Evans then makes some further ridiculous remarks, which I will analyse fully in my next video, which will examine the performance and contribution of Dr. Evans to this documentary. Neonatologist Dr. Neil Aiton then appears for the first time, and there is some discussion of child O. Dr. Aiton explains why there are medical explanations for this infant, citing high ventilation pressures and abdominal distension. Fellow neonatologist Dr. Dimitrova also appears, and there is discussion of the cannula causing bleeding. Dimitrova comments, without a doubt, this is not a query. This is what happened. It is so obvious. So I've discussed this previously in the two videos that you can see on the screen now. Lucy Letby, The Truth About BBC Panorama Needle Claims, and Lucy Letby, Why is a Needle Insertion Causing Controversy? I don't want to go over all the details again because this is a review of this documentary and those videos last for 1 hour and 40 minutes. However, there is a document from the Thirlwell inquiry that indicates very clearly that blood was aspirated during this procedure and there were major mistakes made, and all neonatologists agree on this. It's not even remotely controversial, it's just that people have tried to make a big fuss out of it because they're desperately clinging to the fact that they want to believe Lucy Letby is guilty, so they've got to try and find anything that they can possibly produce in order to nitpick, as they have nothing of any real substance. And there were perhaps some comments made at some point by Dr. Richard Taylor that were slightly less cautious than they might have been, but actually they were largely factually correct. And every neonatologist that looks at this case has concluded that there was a mistake made with a routine procedure that has caused bleeding, and in fact it's impossible to account for the presence of blood that was noted on the unit at that time. So it's known to be the case. Without this explanation, we just simply cannot account for the blood that is not contested by anyone. I should mention as well that Michelle Warden gave some very interesting detail on this procedure and child O and the problem with the needle in the video that you can see on the screen now. When this happened, we know for a fact that blood was aspirated at the time this was taking place. We know for a fact that this process was done incorrectly. None of this is contested by anyone who is serious or credible. But I just needed to point this out, and this is why, again, two neonatologists are stating in this documentary that this is the case, because they know it's the case. And that's why it's in their report and why it's in the panel report. So the expert panel that is acting in Lucy Letby's defence, they have mentioned this mistake with an aspiration, and they've said it's a contributing factor. So that's why they're saying in the documentary, it's because it's true. There is then some more inept commentary from Evans that I'll address in my next video, before the prolific commenter on this topic, Peter Elston, then discusses why the shift rotor is wrong. Peter Elston says, when the verdicts were announced, I wrote about it on my blog saying that I think anybody can see from that roster chart that this uninterrupted line of X's that is used in this shift chart that was significant in court, that would have been extremely convincing. But frankly, this was deeply, deeply flawed indeed, and I wouldn't pick any statistician to give it any credence whatsoever. So what I will mention with regard to that is that I'll be interviewing some statisticians on this channel in the near future. Of course, I've already interviewed Professor Richard Gill 3 times, but I will be conducting a couple of interviews with some new people, very credentialed professors of statistics over the next few weeks. There is then some discussion with Stephen, who I believe is tried by Stats Online, and they explain that the case of child C is a textbook bowel obstruction. We know this anyway, and you may have heard me discuss this recently with Professor Colin Morley. If not, then please feel free to watch that interview. When the international panel convened and assessed the case of Child C, not surprisingly, they cited this very obvious bowel obstruction. We then hear some explanation in the documentary of how Dr. Evans moved the dates around in this case because the previous date that he'd cited didn't fit Lucy Letby being on duty. He also changed his mind during the court case and after the court case on this particular infant and with regard to other infants, and this is discussed in the film. The well-known broadcaster and journalist Jeremy Vine also makes an appearance in the film to discuss Child C. I've discussed this matter in previous videos and I'll no doubt make a video solely on Child C in the near future, so I'm not going to go into that in any more depth, but everything that's discussed in the documentary is well established. Unless you're Liz Hull, of course. Liz Hull, from her position of great knowledge and wisdom, says, "I just don't think it is important." So firstly, I'm struggling to see how Liz Hull is a legitimate arbiter of what is or isn't important. I mean, she has a fairly extraordinary level of self-regard if she can just decide it doesn't matter the scientific and medical evidence, which she doesn't understand and she knows nothing about, she has no qualifications or credentials related to whatsoever, can be changed around in the middle of the court case and even after the court case, and she can just decide that it doesn't matter because she was in court and she's done a podcast. Although I'm not sure if she's mentioned that. Did she mention that she's been in court? I'm not sure if she's ever mentioned that she was in court every day. Let us reflect again at this point that Liz Hull is a prolific commenter on this case. In fact, I'd describe her as a positive rent-a-gob. But when she was asked about being directly paid by Cheshire Police by the Daily Telegraph, she wasn't quite so forthcoming with any comment. Her statement that the moving around of cases in the case of Child C isn't important is frankly staggering in itself and indicates a complete lack of understanding and objectivity. It is in fact critically important because the entire prosecution case rests on Lucy Letby always being on duty. In this shift chart that's now been completely discredited by multiple statisticians, this was an absolutely critical component of the overall prosecution case. To furthermore cite one incident and go into court indicating that this is the key incident, and then change your mind during a court case and completely shift the day on which this supposedly key incident happens to another incident that you had never cited previously is unbelievable. It's spectacularly inappropriate and shows a complete lack of objectivity from the prosecution expert Dr. Evans, who of course also appears in this film. That is one thing that Liz Hull and Dewi Evans definitely have in common, a complete lack of competence and objectivity. Liz Hull then continues. The jury were reminded by the lead prosecutor in his closing speech that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty on the 12th of June. Now, I know we're not exactly likely to see Liz Hull on Mastermind anytime soon, but this is a statement of such guileless stupidity that it barely even requires any response from myself. But I've literally just explained to you exactly why this does matter. If you can't understand why this matters, and yet you're in court every day, I think she was in court every day as far as I know, I'm not sure if Liz has mentioned this or not, one must question whether you have the basic intellect and competence required to report on this case. So then Liz treats us to her next trenchant insight. Dr. Evans was supported in court by at least 7 medical experts. Let's just count a few of the ways in which this is an abjectly stupid statement. Firstly, this decision was made solely by Dr. Evans in court without any consultation with anyone else, so it's therefore immediately irrelevant that there were other experts in court. That discounts this statement on its own without any further consideration. Secondly, even if this decision had been part of some sort of joint process, which it definitely was not, this wouldn't make changing a critical incident in the middle of the court case any better. Thirdly, we know that Dr. Evans has changed the diagnosis again since the court case was concluded. Liz Hull must know this as well. This obviously invalidates further still the argument that other experts were involved, as they clearly were not. Fourthly, it's a hugely significant factor that Dr. Evans is sitting in the courtroom staring across at Lucy Letby, the defendant, when he changes an incident that he previously deemed to be significant because Lucy Letby, the defendant, isn't on duty, and then cites another incident that he had never mentioned previously as being of any significance, and then says that is now the reason that the baby collapsed because the defendant, Lucy Letby, was on duty. Now, quite frankly, if you can't see that, Liz, then you are quite considerably stupid. But then Liz continues, but actually, there's only one prosecution expert giving media interviews, isn't there? I'm sure the others have seen the way that Dr. Evans has been treated online and the way that his opinions have been ridiculed and have been looked at and thought, I don't want to speak publicly for that reason. So I think with regard to that, I don't think it's accurate to state that the opinions of Dr. Evans have been ridiculed. I think that it's been pointed out that what he did in court has no scientific merit, and he himself has humiliated himself by giving multiple interviews in which he's either made ridiculous statements or repeatedly contradicted himself, even contradicting things that occurred in the court case. So I don't think Dr. Evans has been ridiculed, as Liz Hull puts it here. I think he's ridiculed himself. Another thing to add here is that it would not be normal for expert witnesses to give media interviews. There's no particular reason that should happen. I'm sure Liz Hull is aware that's not normal practice. This is admittedly a very high-profile case, so the media is more likely to contact the witnesses. But Dr. Evans could have said from day one, immediately after the court case ended, I don't wish to speak to anyone. Indeed, that is exactly what all the other expert witnesses have done. Dr. Evans could have said, I've played my part in this court case, I'll go home to Carmarthen, tend to my garden and pick my daffodils. I'm very glad he didn't do that, because he's given us an enormous amount of useful information and ammunition, all of which indicates that this is a chronically unsafe conviction and that he's a deeply unsuitable witness. That's probably why the other experts aren't speaking out. They're probably embarrassed that they've been involved in this court case. There's a very good chance that some of them are thinking this guy's making us look like idiots. Although it should be stated as well that most of the prosecution witnesses contributed very little to this court case. The prosecution case is 95% Dr. Dewi Evans, but I'll be covering this point in more depth when I deal with other contributions to the documentary in full, particularly in the video on Dr. Evans. Later, Mark McDonnell comments that Evans is going to get his comeuppance. Evans will go down as one of the worst individuals that a court has ever asked to give evidence, ever. Now that's a perfectly fair statement, but from what I've seen, I think the general consensus would be that Roy Meadow, who was responsible both directly and indirectly for multiple miscarriages of justice, is the worst expert witness ever. However, I would like to suggest that Dewi Evans is worse. In the case of Roy Meadow, he made one very confident assertion that proved to be enormously influential and damaging. Dewi Evans has made a laundry list of ridiculous statements both during and after the court case. His cross-examination during the court case is truly surreal, and he was utterly demolished in court. It's just that the process was so unfair that the jury in some ways was given little alternative other than to convict Lucy Letby, even though I personally think that if I was in the jury, I would have seen that it wasn't proven beyond reasonable doubt. I know someone who knows all of these witnesses quite well, so I'd be interested to see if she agrees with me, but I personally think Dewi Evans is the worst expert witness that has ever existed and hopefully ever will exist. Speaking of Dr. Evans, he then comments that he's had to put up with an awful lot of social media abuse. That should not happen, and it certainly shouldn't happen to somebody who's played a part in convicting one of England's worst female serial killers. This statement is so indicative of the whole mindset of Dr. Evans. Firstly, I want to point out that I'm extremely doubtful that Dr. Evans has received significant social media abuse because he doesn't have any social accounts. He has an account on LinkedIn, but that's it. He doesn't have any other social accounts at all. Now, I'd be very surprised if he'd received a lot of social media abuse on LinkedIn because it's the least likely platform on which he would receive abuse. He may have been questioned, he may have been challenged, he may have been attacked. I'm very doubtful that he's received a lot of abuse on LinkedIn because it's simply not associated with abuse, and you have to confirm your identity in order to have an account. He may have interpreted this as abuse because he simply believes that he's correct about everything and he doesn't believe that anyone else has the right to even challenge him. He may interpret that as abuse, but I'm extremely doubtful that he's received any abuse at all. He certainly hasn't given us any proof that he's received abuse. The only proof we have is his word, and at this point, his word really doesn't carry a great deal of credibility. If he means people commenting online is abuse, then the definition of the word abuse is becoming pretty elastic, in my opinion. The second thing about this statement is that it's indicative of a boo-hoo, poor me, you should respect me, look at all the difficult things that I'm going through attitude. What Dr. Evans doesn't seem to understand is that respect isn't something you're able to demand. It's not something you're automatically afforded. You have to earn that respect. I certainly don't advocate or endorse any abuse towards Dr. Evans, even though he's clearly fabricated this abuse that he supposedly received. But if you want to know the reason why you're going through a difficult time in your life, Dr. Evans, all you need to do is look in the mirror. The experience that you're going through is entirely merited. In fact, you haven't suffered anywhere near enough yet. You will be completely discredited and you will be completely disgraced, and your children will have to live with that for the rest of their lives, and that's entirely your own fault. Additionally, for Dr. Evans to feel sorry for himself, considering what he's responsible for and has been responsible for in the past, because this isn't the first time his evidence has caused something awful to occur. His evidence previously resulted in children being taken away from their parents, and this was later overturned on appeal in a case in Northern Ireland. And Evans was criticised by the judge. Before the Worthless case as well, that's another case, and then this is a third case. So I wonder if he ever feels sorry for the parents who had the children taken away from them. He clearly feels sorry for himself, but I would suggest that this is indicative of a narcissistic personality type. Lucy Letby has already been behind bars for 5 years, and is facing 15 life sentences entirely because of the risible standard of work that Dr. Evans did in this case. I can assure you that no one in their right mind feels sorry for you. Now, I'm not going to discuss all of Dr. Evans' specific claims because I will address those in my next video, but I do want to mention one particularly embarrassing claim. Dr. Evans makes the following statement, and on top of that, of course, they're Americans, they're Canadians, they don't know how the system works here. Americans have a reputation for functioning as hired guns. This is the statement of unbelievable hypocrisy, but let's continue. I've experienced this a couple of times where the other side will seek an opinion from across the Atlantic because they can't get an honest opinion from the UK. No, there's no doubt about it. So the first thing to note here is that he said that Mark MacDonald is seeking an opinion from across the Atlantic because they can't get an honest opinion from the UK. So what he's implying here is that the American and Canadian people in this expert panel that is entirely comprised of world-class experts are giving a dishonest opinion. Essentially, he's accused them of lying. Now that's a fairly strong accusation in the first place, but let's consider this. None of these experts have anything to gain from this process. They've all volunteered their time because they care about their specialism, they care about truth, and they care about justice, sometimes investing their own money to travel. Let alone are they being paid for this, like Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans has been paid an enormous amount of money to be involved in this case, to spend 5 years mucking around with documents with Cheshire Police, after he actively inserted himself into the court case by reading about this in the paper, contacting the National Crime Agency, and desperately trying to become involved. He then made a 7-hour round trip from his home in Chester, his home to Chester, I should say, in order to meet with police, and according to his own words, decided within a matter of minutes that there was definitely inflicted harm in this case. So I will ask you this rhetorical question. Do you think Dr. Evans is more likely to have gained from being involved in this? Or do you think the panel is more likely to have gained from being involved in this? And I'll ask you a second rhetorical question. Do you think Dr. Evans is more likely to have given an honest opinion? Or do you think the panel are more likely to have given an honest opinion? The second thing is that Dr. Evans has made these disparaging remarks about medics from the United States and Canada. Now, this was truly a gasp-inducing moment, but leaving aside the accuracy or otherwise of these comments, let's actually assess how many of the panel to which he's referring are Canadian or American. So if you've seen Professor Xu Li, heard Professor Xu Li talk, or indeed know the name of Professor Xu Li, if you're particularly perceptive, you may be able to perceive that he's not actually from Canada. Indeed, Professor Xu Li was educated at the University of Singapore. It should be noted that he later studied at Harvard University, and we're going to get into that more in due course. Despite having a European-sounding name, Professor Eric Eichenwald is American. Now, Professor Eichenwald graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1984. We're going to discuss that in a second, but I'll just mention as well that you can see this video the professor is involved in, and if you just watch a few minutes of this video, reducing antibiotic usage in NICU involving Professor Eric Eichenwald, you'll see how much more professional, how much more intelligent, how much more articulate, how much forensic he is in his work than Dr. Evans. So let's look at the World University Rankings for Medicine for the current year, and you'll notice that Harvard University is number 1 in the world. So I think for Dr. Evans, who hasn't even been in a hospital for 20 years, to sit there dismissing several, and we're going to see the name Harvard University cropping up again later in this section, is pretty extraordinary for Dr. Evans to dismiss these people. We also see here Sweden's Karolinska Institute being mentioned, which continues to perform well for academic reputation. Of course, there is someone in the panel from the Karolinska Institute as well. The University of Toronto is highly regarded. We also see the University of Toronto featuring very prominently in this panel. That's why people are saying they're world-class experts. These are literally the best people in the world, quite literally. Not only do they massively outrank Dr. Evans, but also his attitude towards them is genuinely embarrassing. But I'll talk about that more at the end of this section. So let's move on to the next member of the panel, Professor Helmut Hummler. Now, you may be not hugely surprised to learn that he's not American or Canadian. He's obviously German and has worked all over the world. Dr. Tetsuya Isayama, surprisingly, is also not Canadian or American. He's Japanese and works in Tokyo. Dr. Joanne Langley is Canadian. If you read her entire biography, she's had an incredible, sparkling career, has done all manner of impressive things, including being a government advisor to this day. Frankly, Dr. Evans isn't fit to polish her shoes. Professor Nina Modi is arguably the most credentialed neonatologist in Britain. I'm not sure what else to say about that, but she's neither Canadian nor American. I would certainly have been able to guess the nationality of Professor Mikael Norman just from his name, and of course he's Swedish, as I mentioned earlier, associated with the Karolinska Institute. You may be aware that Sweden is not located in North America. So our next expert is Professor Bruno Piedberth. Again, not a very Canadian sounding name or North American sounding name, but of course Professor Bruno Piedberth is French-Canadian, involved in the paediatric department at the Université Laval, who works in Quebec. Now, I personally don't think it's fair or accurate to lump in French-Canadians as being part of the same culture as Americans. I've actually been to Canada relatively recently. I know, in fact, both a paediatrician and a neonatologist in Canada. I know them rather well. I stayed at their house a couple of years ago. I haven't involved them in this case because they're friends of mine and I didn't think it would be fair. But I do know a little bit about healthcare in Canada, and as I say, I do know an award-winning doctor and a neonatologist in Canada very, very well. Now, I personally, as I say, don't think it's fair to just lump French Canadians in as part of being the same culture as people in North America. It's quite easy to forget that these are enormous geographical regions. Most people know the United States is a big country geographically, but you can tend to forget because Canada hasn't got such a huge profile. It's an enormous country compared to Britain in particular. It's a very diverse place, and of course the United States is, I would say it's a fair statement to say it's the most diverse country in the world. I think it's difficult to argue against that, certainly. So for Dr. Evans to say basically all Canadians and all Americans are the same, it's worse. If I was to say Dr. Evans is Welsh, and that means that he's basically English, I'm sure he wouldn't take very kindly to that, and it would be a ridiculous statement, of course. But saying that all Canadians and Americans are all the same, and it's all the same culture all the way across North America, is even more ridiculous because you're looking at a much, much greater geographical region that has a much more diverse culture than England and Wales or anything involved with Britain. So it's simply an utterly ridiculous and embarrassing statement in and of itself. Even when you do actually locate someone who is actually working in Canada, who was actually born in Canada, which most of this group are not. Of course, I haven't even mentioned that all these people are world-class neonatologists and Dr. Evans is a retired paediatrician who hasn't worked in a hospital for 20 years. Our next expert is Professor Prakash Kumar Shah. Now, it may not hugely surprise you to learn that Professor Prakash Kumar Shah is Indian. Indeed, he's been involved in projects all over the world. He's involved in a collaborative project involving 11 countries and has been evaluating preconceptional, prenatal and postpartum interventions to develop healthy trajectories of growth in a cluster randomised trial in southern India. He does work in Canada. He's involved in work at the Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. He's a professor in the Department of Paediatrics and Institute of Health Policy at the highly regarded University of Toronto, but I think to characterise him as being Canadian is fairly ridiculous. Our next expert is Professor Emeritus Nalini Singhal. Now, you may be able to have a wild stab in the dark here and guess that Professor Singhal is Indian. The next expert is Professor Eric Skarsgård. Now, he is legitimately Canadian. I just wanted to point out that along with his absolutely glittering career in neonatology and paediatrics, Professor Skarsgård studied at Stanford University, which is the number 3 in the world in medicine, behind the aforementioned Harvard University and the University of Oxford. Professor Ann Stark is American, having graduated from the number 1 medical school in the world, Harvard Medical School. Professor Jeff Chase is from New Zealand. Helen Shannon was born in this country and lives in Cheshire. We then have Dr. Neil Aiton, who's been mentioned already in this video, who is, of course, British, a specialist in paediatrics registered with the General Medical Council, a consultant neonatologist at the Royal Sussex County Hospital since 1998. We next have Professor Alan Wayne Jones, who was born in Pontypridd, Wales. I'm therefore surprised that Dr. Evans hasn't got more positive things to say about him, but he spent most of his career working in Sweden, where he's had a particularly credentialed and highly regarded career. Dr. Richard Taylor is a specialist in paediatrics. He's been a consultant neonatologist at Surrey Memorial Hospital in Canada, but he's obviously British, was born in Britain, and lived in Britain for most of his life. Dr. Adil Ismail, a retired consultant in clinical biochemistry and chemical endocrinology, Director of Pathology Services, who works at Leeds Medical School, is not Canadian or American, as you may have noted. Professor Matthew Yoll is American. He lives in Illinois and has worked at Illinois Valley Community College. Dr. Hilda Wilkinson Herbots is Associate Professor in the Department of Statistical Science at University College London. She is also not Canadian or American. We do have another American here in this section with a paediatric endocrinologist, Charles Stanley MD, who works at the University of Pennsylvania. And last but not least, finally being announced as part of the panel recently was Gisli Hannes Gudjonsson, who you may be able to guess is not Canadian or American. This is an Icelandic-British academic educator, forensic psychologist and former detective, awarded the CBE, who works at King's College London and is professor in the psychology department at Reykjavik University. So of these 20 experts, 5 of them are legitimately North American and 15 are not North American. Some of them work in Canada or the United States, but as they're not ethnically Canadian or ethnically American, I'm not sure it's entirely fair or accurate to just lump them in with everyone else. Similarly, the gentleman who is French-Canadian lives and works in a completely different culture. Now, the attitude of Dr. Evans here could even be deemed borderline racist. It's certainly jingoistic. What it actually smacks of is sheer desperation. It's the sheer desperation of knowing that you're in an extremely serious situation now. I will be analysing the full contribution of Dr. Evans to this documentary in my next video, but I will briefly mention there is one rather amusing moment when he accuses the panel of failing to get their facts right. That is deeply ironic when one of the central arguments that he makes, and it's an extraordinary argument as well, and an absurd argument in and of itself, with regard to the United States and Canada, is not even factually correct. When you actually look at the panel, his views are laughable, frankly. The more that Dr. Evans speaks, the clearer it becomes how unreliable he is and how he's willing to say almost anything, basically the first thing that comes into his head, rather than to confront the actual obvious reality that he is plain wrong about everything that he said in this court case. I will now quote what Dr. Philip Hammond said about this. I don't think Dewi Evans will ever admit he's made a mistake. I think he's stuck in that mindset. Speaking of people who never admit they've made a mistake, Liz Hull then appears again, and she says the following. Ben Myers, who was Lucy Letby's original barrister, has never given a media interview. There are many things wrong with this case, but Mark McDonald's strategy is obviously very different, as I've spoken to other lawyers who say that that's not a strategy that they would adopt. I'm not aware that Mark McDonald has won lots of miscarriage of justice cases by adopting this public media strategy. So, as I've mentioned in previous videos, Liz Hull is literally in love with the court system. She doesn't have a single relevant thing to say about any of the evidence. All she ever says is, the court is wonderful, the judges are wonderful, the court case was wonderful, the jury is wonderful, barristers are wonderful. She's the perfect court reporter in many ways, except for the fact that she has absolutely no critical thinking ability whatsoever. Or is it that she has no critical thinking ability, or is it that the payment this company received has coloured her perspective quite significantly? Only Liz Hull will know this, only Liz Hull has the opportunity to speak about this, and only Liz Hull has declined to speak about this. Frankly, it's an insult to our intelligence that she even appears in this film. There is then some discussion of the insulin cases, pointing out many of the problems with them. I've already made 5 videos about this, which you can see in the playlist here. I'm not going to go into this in any depth because it's very complicated and this video will be long enough. I'll probably make some more videos on the insulin cases in the future. I want to emphasise that I've spoken to many top experts in the preparation of the chapter in my book on the insulin cases. I've had it diligently fact-checked, and I've revealed as much as I can in these videos, but I do need to hold some of that back for the book. But I've already spent many hours discussing the insulin cases in these videos. I'm not going to go over it all again in this video. It's highly complicated, and if you want to know more about it, you can watch those videos. We then see some footage of the panel and hear some of their explanations. Dr. Philip Hammond notes that the journalists and some quite experienced journalists in the room couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. We then hear from Dr. Evans again, making some comments about the panel. Again, I will analyse these in full in my next video. Suffice to say that his comments were rabid, unfounded, and embarrassing. So Dr. Evans says all this very dismissive stuff, and then we see this exchange. The filmmaker Daniel Bogado says to him, "Is this the first time you've seen this press conference?" And Dewi Evans says, "No, I haven't watched it yet." "Is this the first time you've watched it?" Bogado says. "Yes," he says. And then we see this kind of surreal moment where Dr. Evans watches the panel on television in the armchair in his sitting room, and you can see him sinking into it, becoming and more, it's almost vanishing before our eyes. Very, very skillfully edited, actually. And I'm going to discuss that in full in my next video on this documentary. But I want you to bear a couple of things in mind at this point. Firstly, Dr. Evans has already been to the British Medical Journal and said, "No one I respect has spoken on this subject, and no organisation or institution that I respect has offered an opinion on this subject." So, even just on the basis of Professor Nina Modi alone, just one member of the panel, she massively outranks Dr. Evans. She's one of the top neonatologists in the country. She's arguably numero uno among neonatologists in the country. She's one of the most credentialed people in medicine in the entire country, who's been the head of 3 top neonatology organisations in the country. Even just in relation to her, it's ridiculous. When you look at the experience and expertise and credentials of this panel collectively, it truly is an embarrassing comment. It's another rabid commentary from Dr. Evans, essentially. That would be bad enough if he'd actually bothered to watch the press conference before. Now, in my profession, I'm a writer. I suppose I'm a sort of semi-competent content creator as well now. So if a panel of the top writers in the world got together and reviewed a book that I'd written, or reviewed my work, or indeed said anything about me at all, and they held a press conference that lasted for 2 hours, and it was talking solely about me and what I'd done, I would pay attention. Regardless of whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. It would really hurt if it was bad, obviously, but I'd just have to deal with it. If it was indifferent, then that's got pluses and minuses. And of course, if they praised me, it would be good. But I wouldn't ignore it. I wouldn't have a panel of the world's top writers talking about my book and say, well, I'll just completely ignore this. Obviously, I'd pay attention. And that's not even a great analogy in many ways, because it's far more important if it's medical matters for very obvious reasons. But Dr. Evans thinks he can say, "Oh, I don't respect these people in the slightest, but I won't even bother watching their press conference." I mean, quite frankly, what a half-baked, 2-bit, tin pot joke of a human being. Speaking of people who are incapable of being objective, Liz Hull then makes some further comments, which I'll analyse in a forthcoming video on her contribution. But what she says is essentially already countered by Dr. Philip Hammond, who says the following: "People will jump on the fact that there will be nuanced differences between the different experts. One of them said we think liver damage happened during the birth. The other one said we think liver damage happened by the sticking of a needle into the liver. So there's a difference in those interpretations, but both of them found no evidence of deliberate harm. It's not unusual to have those differences, and I don't think that negates the validity of their reports. What was so powerful about Shuli's statement was that it was so clear that there was very, very poor medical care. The unit simply was not up to the task of coping with such a complex workload. Instead, we decided to blame it all on the nurse for being a murderer. 2 babies died every day, probably avoidably, in the NHS because we don't have the staff and the expertise and the facilities to save them. And that's the lesson that needs to come out of this. We don't want more witch hunts for murderers. We want properly staffed NHS units with a proper safety culture so more babies each year are saved and more mothers are saved. What we do see throughout the film is particularly Liz Hull, but also Dewi Evans making appeals to emotion. Liz Hull then repeats this outside of the Criminal Cases Review Commission. The section with the parents in this film lasts for 15 minutes of the film, and that is entirely an appeal to emotion. Typically, an appeal to emotion is considered to be a bad argument. And I should say as well that nothing of any substance whatsoever is presented to explain why the conviction of Lucy Letby is safe, or indeed why the highly credentialed critics of this court case are incorrect. And then the film ends with another appeal to emotion from the parents and more absolute idiocy from Dr. Evans, who says 2 of my 4 grandchildren were born at the same time that Lucy Letby was wreaking carnage in Chester Hospital. The children murdered by her now should be at school, enjoying holidays, enjoying life. That will never happen. Clearly Lucy Letby should confess, but I don't think she will. I think she's blanked off all of her crimes in order to be able to live with herself. Not only is this yet another appeal to emotion, which he himself uses all the way through the film, it is something that he's not even remotely qualified to talk about, and it's absolutely pure speculation. Yet Dr. Evans is utterly laughable. He wouldn't even be a credible commentator on daytime TV, let alone a credible expert in a court case of this magnitude. He should never have been allowed by the Cheshire Constabulary to be involved so centrally in this court case. It's a calamity. What has occurred is a national embarrassment, and it's just a matter of how big the embarrassment becomes. This will be something that is talked about for decades and indeed centuries, and it will always be a source of national embarrassment for this country. Nonetheless, in the next video that I make, I will assess and analyse Dr. Evans' full contribution to this documentary. In summary, while this film can be described as a documentary, it leans very heavily on its narrative aspects. I do have some personal thoughts on this, particularly the obsession that the media has with presenting things in this narrative fashion and always having everything being based on human interest. There's actually a sketch about this by Mitchell and Webb in which they're talking about the invasion of the Earth by aliens, and they're presenting a news programme, and then one of the presenters turns to the camera and says, "Okay, the Earth's been invaded by aliens. What's your opinion on this subject? Do you have an opinion? Perhaps you live on Earth or know someone who does." And I don't even think that's necessarily an exaggeration. I can easily imagine there'd be a phone-in with Nicky Campbell where he'd be saying, "Okay, does anyone have any opinions on the aliens?" There just seems to be a complete obsession with everything being a human interest, everything being about narratives, everything being about opinions. And I personally love literature, and fiction is very much in my heart. But there can be times where you need to drill down into the facts of a subject. This is one of those subjects where it's important to convey the facts and science more than the story and emotions. And I feel that it's a reasonable criticism of this documentary that it fails to fully do this, in my opinion. As an example of this, Professor Shu Lee appears in this film, as does Dr. Dewi Evans. Professor Shu Lee admittedly appears via archive footage, and yet there's no attempt to convey the issues with air embolism and the injection of air theories that were used in the court case, despite the fact that the paper co-authored by Dr. Lee in 1989 was the sole diagnostic source of this so-called diagnosis that appears in the court case, and now Professor Lee has rejected it and stated that his work was completely misused. Furthermore, many credible medics have assessed and examined this case by now, and literally no one supports the theory of air embolism whatsoever. I've discussed this at great depth in other videos, but the primary reason for this is the way that it was diagnosed originally by Dr. Evans can only be described as farcical, so no credible doctor will ever side with that. That is why there hasn't been a single credible or serious person that's come out to support the prosecution case. I think it's somewhat disappointing that such information was excluded from this documentary when it's not particularly difficult to convey. The documentary filmmakers could have asked Dr. Evans about this instead of the more generalised questions that were put to him, even though admittedly he still couldn't handle any of those with anything that even remotely approached competence. Similarly, the issues around Child K and Dr. Jairam could have been mentioned. That is very easy to deal with. He simply gave a misleading account in court. I will say that the documentary decides to focus on Dr. Evans and Mark MacDonald. The consultants don't appear at all. They're not even particularly referenced apart from one passing reference to Dr. Stephen Brewery. But I still think contextually it could be relevant to talk about this testimony that we now rightly believe to be, at best, very unreliable. But fundamentally, it seems that the decision was made to make what is, to a great extent, a narrative film that doesn't deep dive into the science of the Lucy Letby case. Now, I personally don't necessarily agree with that editorial decision, but even taking this into consideration, the film asked people to make a determination regarding the case without providing what I would consider to be the full information or context required to do this. Despite this, the editors and producers have chosen to create a figurative demarcation between the first and second halves of the film. The earlier portion of the film leans towards efforts to buttress the prosecution, and the latter portion is more focused on the sustained challenge to this conviction. Even within this documentary, which I believe is not bad, pretty good, but does have some elements that I would personally criticise, it still becomes crystal clear during this film that arguments made by those that are sceptical of the conviction of Lucy Letby are simply far stronger. Indeed, there is nothing of substance whatsoever to support the prosecution case, and those who appear in favour of the prosecution or the notion of guilt are palpably weak and inconsequential. All of the substance comes from those who either believe Lucy Letby to be innocent, or at least that this is a chronically unsafe conviction. We hear nothing of substance from those who wish to offer support to the prosecution. Liz Hull is as trite, trivial and tedious as usual, while Dr. Evans can barely string a coherent sentence together. Anyone encountering these people for the first time may indeed wonder how Lucy Letby was convicted. The film ultimately correctly leans very strongly towards this being a chronically unsafe conviction, and all serious and intelligent people will see this. I am critical of the scenes with the parents, as they have no merit whatsoever from an evidential perspective, and indeed are not remotely related to the indictment. I therefore question the editorial decision to devote 15 minutes to them, while fundamental aspects of the case are not included. Naturally, you feel sorry for the parents, you feel sorry for them that they've been through such a difficult experience, but it was utterly irrelevant to the subject of the documentary. Someone really needs to sit down with the parents and explain to them that Lucy Letby didn't harm their infant, and indeed there is no evidence to support this. I'm not sure putting the parents in a major film and giving their views credence is particularly helpful for them. It could even be reasonably argued that it's unethical, as the filmmakers are potentially further cementing this false impression by associating it with the heightened emotion of appearing in a televised film. I can't personally conceive of any justification for the small amount of medical information included in this film, as there are many experts that could have been included. We do see a few segments, but it's not as much as I would have personally liked to see. And as I say, a certain amount of the documentary is, in my opinion, invested on interviewing the parents, which doesn't have a great deal of value, not least because they're not in the indictment. There's no evidence that the infant was ever harmed. I do understand that television in particular is obsessed with human interest, but from a value and evidential perspective, it would have been better to hear more science and less human interest. I will say in mitigation that there is some good material in this film. It does hold the attention of the viewer. There is undoubtedly some good footage and interesting material. But much of this originates from the fact that this is such an extraordinary story in the first place. If you get someone like Dewi Evans on camera, who is willing to say seemingly anything, even that he makes the claim that Professor Lee has been subconsciously programmed, it's pure gold for any filmmaker. And the big takeaway from this film is obviously that Dr. Dewi Evans is absolutely crazy and an utter shyster. I mean, that would be the big takeaway if we didn't know that already. Evans makes his usual brain-dead specious arguments and moronic self-defeating commentary, providing nothing of any substance, bizarrely believing that this somehow exonerates him from criticism. He starts behaving in a fashion that can be reasonably described as jingoistic, criticising not only eminent scientists but the countries that they are associated with. He's not only factually incorrect, but he has truly jumped the shark at this point. In my next video, I'll be fully analysing the contribution of Evans, but I want to finish this video with a simple thought. If you still believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, despite the avalanche of evidence that points to the blindingly obvious conclusion that there were no crimes committed and that the County Chester instead was simply a failing hospital with a failing neonatal unit, you are siding with this man and pretty much this man alone. There is no serious or credible person who has come forward to support the arcane theories of Dr. Evans. I think I must add as well that it's very clear from this film, and indeed pretty much every media appearance that Evans has made, that this is a gentleman of very modest ability, and he just wasn't up to the intellectual standard required for this case. He should never have been allowed anywhere near it, even if he was at his physical and intellectual peak, which as we see in this film is clearly not the case. No one could come away from this film having any faith in Evans or the highly dubious science that he has inserted into the court case. This film strongly, almost profoundly, supports the obvious reality that this is an unsafe conviction. Finally, I want to make one thing crystal clear. I'm siding with an enormous and growing list of experts across fields including neonatology, paediatrics, nursing, statistics, chemistry, obstetrics, endocrinology, engineering and clinical medicine, psychology, perinatal medicine, biochemistry, genetics, radiology, pathology, infectious disease specialism, molecular biology, vascular surgery, forensic science, pediatrics and fetal surgery, forensic toxicology, anaesthetics, epidemiology, and psychiatry. Indeed, I've spoken to experts across many of these specialisms. Anyone that believes Lucy Letby is guilty is siding pretty much entirely with this man. So if you still believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, please sit down and have a very serious think about that. If you've watched the Channel 4 documentary and you're new to this case, you may wish to watch my previous video, Lucy Letby BBC Panorama, the 200 Problems You Didn't Hear, which discusses, as you might imagine, 200 problems with the initial prosecution case. This other video, Can You Explain Why the Conviction of Lucy Letby is Fundamentally Flawed, in less than 15 minutes, provides a shorter summary of many of the problems with this case. Another interesting video for people that are new to the Lucy Letby case is the Lucy Letby jury never heard these 40 critical things. You'll be surprised to learn of some of the things that were denied to the jury and the court in this remarkable miscarriage of justice. Finally, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already and you enjoyed this video, it's always very much appreciated when people do subscribe. If you're new to the Lucy Letby case, I do make videos every couple of days. I've already interviewed numerous experts. I'm going to be interviewing many experts in the weeks to come, and I make videos every couple of days, delving into as many different aspects of this case as possible. I do invest quite a lot of work in this, and as you can see, my subscriber count has grown to over 3,300 in 6 months. But there's still a lot of people that watch the videos who are not subscribed, so if you're not subscribed already, it would be hugely appreciated if you did subscribe to the channel. With that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I always enjoy reading and responding to your comments. So if you do have any comments, queries, questions, corrections, or any other observations, please do leave them in the comments section, and I'll look forward to reading them.